Hello YouTube, it is I, once again, Bailey from Teams of Sharks, here to bring you, jazz hands, a new segment, and this is what I like to call Good Talk. And pretty much what the segment's going to be is, just having a talk about a certain topic, something I feel like talking about, or, anyone on the team feels like talking about. And today I'm going to discuss the topic of Overlord. Is the deck tier 1 or not? Reminder that this is all my opinion, and this is all just what I've experienced through testing. None of this is law, and none of this is like 100 like a football field. Like, this is just my opinion on it. I do not want to like start any arguments or anything like that. But I figured the way I'd go about this is I'd go about the deck's, overall pros and its cons. So I'll start with the pros. Overlord as a deck has very solid, has a good tempo after first stride. The deck's first stride is kind of lackluster, but after first stride, then you have really solid tempo with the Purge. If you feel like, excuse me, if you feel like you can deal, the extra damage, try to tempo yourself out into getting more cards into your hand, that's great. And also the deck, obviously, speaking of the Purge, has the effect to deal damage without having trigger effects, which is a very solid effect overall. And it applies a solid amount of pressure to your opponent, especially at the later that the game goes on. It can retire locked and resist units with the effect of the Destiny, which is obviously very solid. You could technically, in theory, retire 2 locked or resist units in one turn if you use the Destiny's beginning of ride phase skill and then re-ride the Destiny and then use its skills again once you ride it. Like I mentioned before, the deck also gets stronger as the game goes on. So the more damage that you're applying, the more pressure that you're applying, the stronger that the deck gets. The stronger that everything gets, you'll have more drive checks, you have more power columns, everything. It is a very solid late game deck. Speaking of solid power columns, it has very solid power columns with the access of Nahal. All your grade 2s are very good at power columns. With Nahalem on your restanding Vanguard plays, with Evolute and Glow Heater both gaining plus 2000 for each damage that your opponent has when you're on an Overlord stride. And overall, that's very solid because it allows you to apply pressure early game without having to use a lot of resources. And not really early game, I guess, per se. I mean, like, it's okay early game if you first stride Purge and then you put them to 3 or 4, because at least then it's a 16 or 18 on its own, which is, not bad. If you have a booster, it's a good 15k block. And, that's 2 cards out of their hand at least, or a G-Guard, which is very solid. It also has access to Denial Chicken, which before everything started getting a lot of resist, Denial Chicken was so good. Like, it's such, even now, like, the card is still very solid. It disrupts a lot of plays against, for example, Messiah, because if they go for their multi-attack play and you just chicken their fencer, then their entire play is just fucked, which Overlord has, like, the best matchup against Messiah, so, yeah. Denial Chicken's a very solid card. It disrupts plays, but with everything having resist, it seems to be a little faltering in its use. Not really in its use, but more over its accessibility. And of course, you have access to the Ace first stride if you get rushed down by a really bad matchup, per se. Like Nova Grappler right now is a pretty shitty matchup. If Dominate somehow rushes you before stride, they just call out their board and they just start going bananas, setting up the early damage for when they go for a stride. Renee and just fuck your life. And the free Ziegenberg play is very easy to pull off in the deck because you have 2 retire effects on your Vanguard, both at beginning of ride phase and on stride. You can technically retire 3 units in one turn off of just the Destiny alone if you do the same play where you do the beginning of ride phase, the Soul Blast 1 to retire something, then re-ride the Soul Blast 1 to retire something, to stride to counter Blast 1 to check top 7 and retire something. That's 3 cards out of the 5 that realistically your opponent should have. And I doubt that most people are going to have the full board anyway, because against Overlord you want to preserve your hand for the power columns, and shit's going to get retired anyway. So most of the time you won't have to waste all those resources just to, get the full board for the Ziegenberg. Not to mention, with both the Ace and Ziegenberg, you can pretty much get their effects literally for free with the fact of Conroe. Of course, minusing off the fact that the Ace needs to discard, another Overlord and a card, but you know, you kind of even out, you apply pressure with the attacks, and you neg 1 the whole turn because you ditch 1 for stride and you only drive check 2, and you discard 2, and then you drive check another 2. So you're negging 1 over the whole turn if you use Conroe. We could get into all the details about how the negative and plus of, like, of your counterblast if you have Conroe, but I feel like that would just take too long. But pretty much the ace itself, I think you go pretty even on it because you get 2 attacks with the 4 drives, but you -1 when you stride. So overall, I think the ace is a very break-even play, and it gets even better with the reboot rulings. The rush play will get even better, so that way you can counterblast 4 and stand the ace twice off it, off its restanding play because it'll have the 2 floating ones return effects, which is very solid. But you still have to have the overlords to discard for it. So that's pretty much the cons I have for the deck. If I missed anything, please leave it down below in the comments, and I'd be happy to discuss. Now let's get, or rather the pros, sorry. Now let's get into the cons. The deck overall is pretty slow. Like, it's slower than I, want to admit because it kind of has the same issue the deck had back in 2015 where, it was like the cross and we had 8 cards in the stride deck and G cards didn't exist. The deck was just very slow. It didn't have enough pressure, like, to keep up after certain cards came out. Like, it kind of phased out because, Blade Master was getting all the support. Overlord only got support in, G set 1 at the time. And yeah, so the deck is overall it's still a very slow deck because it's a control deck. It's obviously going to be slower. And on to my next point, which I almost kind of spoiled in this one, but whatever. Your first stride is really shitty without setup. Like, pretty much your first stride is either purge just to deal damage, which is kind of lackluster if they're only at like 2 or 3 or whatever. I guess if you don't have the setup, doing it to 3 is the best option because you set up into another purge to deal for 4, or if you get more damage off your rear guards, then you set up more. But, like, that's just kind of the point I'm having, is your first stride requires so much setup. Like, if you want to get the maximum value, you need to search the heal trigger off Conroe, so that means you can't search for anything else, which means if you don't have the stride fodder, or if you don't have the overlord, the extra overlord, you can't search Conroe, you can't search High Flame, that's the name, because you need to search the heal trigger. Unless you opened it or you already have it, you need to search the heal trigger to get the maximum value out of your purge play. And if they end up healing off of that when they're at 3 and you want to deal them to 4, you end up negging, like, the entire turn. Like, your entire setup just is a whole minus if they get a heal trigger on their turn, if they're at 3, which is very unfortunate, honestly. Also, most decks in the meta really don't tend to care about Denial Chicken because, alright, let's see, ZTB I guess does care. ZTB, like, they care, but at the same time not really, because I guess if you retire Party Dragon, then it's very good, because, they don't get the other column. Or if you retire Cruising, but they still get the effect off. If you retire Unicorn, they still get the effect off. They are still generating plus off of this. And if you're retiring Party Dragon, unless it literally fucks their entire turn, it's still plus for them because you're wasting one of your better G cards on a Party Dragon that he can just call out again with, per se, a Spearhead Unicorn or an Avenir Phoenix. Like, Denial Chicken isn't as solid right now because if you're going against Dominate, most of the time you're gonna have to retire your own units because with Rene, after first stride, they'll have the plus 10 in crit, plus 15 in crit with the ones that they call. So you're gonna end up retiring your own units. So you're pretty much minusing off Denial Griffining because they control your units, which is, it's really unfortunate. Dominate kind of like makes Overlord a little, like, not little, it makes it really weaker in the meta right now. The deck doesn't really gain hand advantage in burst, and what I mean by that is no card in the deck really draws you cards besides High Flame. High Flame is the only card that inherently will draw you cards, and that's not really, like, good, because every, like, good deck in the meta right now can draw hand and burst, which is, like, how they can survive the first stride kill meta that we're kind of in right now with Nova Grapplers and Nubatama. And Overlord just doesn't have that. Its main source of hand advantage is through the purge. And you have to maximize the purge by getting to that late game and dealing them to 5 damage. Obviously, if you get critical triggers, then you're in there. Like, you're having a good game. But most Overlord lists that I have seen and what I personally play play less crits because in the end you need the draw power. Like that's why like, and let's say in my build I play 5 draw and 3 stand. The stand is pretty much a pseudo draw trigger on board because you give something +5 and you draw a card, and not to mention it goes back into the deck, which is very solid. So it's essentially like I'm playing 8 draw triggers, but like 3 pseudo ones. And you know, obviously the regular draw triggers are very needed. Like if you get those on purge checks, that's super value. But the deck relies too much on triggers to gain hand advantage, and that is not something that I personally am fond of. The deck only has like one massive power G guard, Absalom, I think his name is, the rare one, but it can only be used on a Vanguard attack. So decks that will keep restanding their rear guards or have power rear guards that keep going at you, and let's say one of these rear guards has resist, then your denial chicken's useless. You don't have a G guard that can like gain any power in your deck because you have defeat flare, which is defeat flare and chicken are all about retiring, and Absalom is only for when your Vanguard is getting swung at their Vanguard, and they have to have an open board for the thing to be value. And if everything has resist with the, excuse me, the Nova Grappler geared one, for example, then obviously then you're not going to be able to retire shit. Like even if the card inherently itself doesn't have resist, then the grade 1 will protect the front row. Obviously you can still defeat flare them because defeat flare doesn't target, but defeat flare itself requires a lot of setup, and I feel like you won't be able to do that until at least their second stride or third stride even, and by then you're probably dead. That's just how I feel. The deck, as I stated before, in general requires so much setup. Like that's why we still have the Conroe starter, because the deck just requires so much setup to get rolling. Like you need to either have the heal trigger, you need to have the other Overlord in hand, you need to hit it off the top 7, which mind you, I've whiffed so many top 7s. Like you guys, anyone who's seen the World Finals, he whiffed like every top 7 on Overlord besides like 1 or 2, I'm pretty sure. And then, you know, Mr. Jesus just could capitalize on the fact that he couldn't pressure enough and just rush him down with blasters. And that was an Overlord favored matchup. Obviously, there was a lot of triggers involved, and the Overlord player didn't end up getting a lot of triggers. But regardless, like, it's still, like, it showed the inconsistency that Overlord still has, like, through not getting his setup. Like, if he didn't get his setup, he was pretty fucked. Like, you could say the same thing about a lot of decks, but Overlord as a deck requires more setup than other decks, which is why we still have the Conroe starter, which is why Conroe didn't get banned, which is why Conroe isn't super OP right now, because the deck is so slow and requires so much setup that it really needs that to even be able to contend with any of the tier 1 decks. And even, in my opinion anyway, the deck really has a hard time against all of them. And which comes to my last point, the deck has more bad matchups in the meta than good. It loses really hard to Dominate. It loses really hard to Nova Grappler. ZTB really fucks the deck with the extra turn dragon, because if they extra turn dragon you, your deck doesn't gain enough hand advantage to last through 2 turns of multi-attack. And you will literally crumble when they extra turn dragon you. It's really unfortunate, like, in that matchup, because it used to be like a pretty solid matchup, and then, you know, extra turn dragon kind of just fucks your resources and makes you like eat shit, and then they just dust you after they just dust, and then you get shit on. Because if you get dusted in Overlord, I mean, you can say this against a lot of decks, you're just gonna fucking lose so hard. Like, and the fact that Overlord doesn't like have one of the better ZRs, like it doesn't have Stark, it doesn't have Dust, you know, like, which, you know, the 2 best ZRs. Drachma is not a bad ZR, like it is not like as shit as everyone says. It's just, it's a lot easier to play around when decks in the meta currently gain so much burst hand advantage through all the inherent drawing that the deck gives them, with the Jeffrey clones that Nova Grappler has, with Dominate in the unit that lets you draw a card when a Dominate unit attacks, and the deck in general just does not have enough hand advantage. If Overlord got like a push to soul +5 crit draw card, I feel like it would, you know, it would help a little bit more with the problem that the deck has of non-burst hand advantage, only really gaining hand advantage off of your purge and your restanding vanguards. And like, with, you only play like, you only use Ziegenberg like once or twice, realistically speaking, and you're not really benefiting too much off of it because you're trying to kill them with Ziegenberg. You're not trying to gain advantage with Ziegenberg. And once you run out of purges, the deck just kind of like slows down really hard, slower than it actually is. And you pretty much, the entire deck is revolved around burning out your opponent's resources in a very slow and grindy game to the point where you can Drachma them, but a lot of decks in the meta will either kill you before you can Drachma, or just you won't be able to burn them out. Like, you will not be able to burn them out if they get their setup. Like, if a lot of decks require a lot less setup than Overlord, it's a lot easier to get, and they get a lot more for it than Overlord does, at least in my opinion. So, to the topic, is Overlord tier 1? Is Overlord still a good deck? In my opinion, Overlord is still a good deck. If I were to rate it in anywhere in the tier, it would be 1.5 to 2. The deck just has a hard time in the meta right now, and it's only good, like, the only good reason to play the deck is if you play against Link Joker. But realistically speaking, the deck's good matchups aren't there anymore. Chaos Breaker isn't like super relevant anymore. The deck is still like, it's in the same tier. It's like 1.5 right now, because like Dominate doesn't care about having a locked board when you just use their units to attack. Nova Grappler has so much unlock in the deck, it's insane. Gear Chronicle, again, just has extra turn dragon, so they wait out the turn that you locked, and then, you know, you go into another turn, and they just go off, so they're still gaining advantage while you have shit locked. It's really, like, tragic. So, do I think Overlord is the tier 1 deck that it used to be? No, definitely not. I feel like the deck has slowed down way too much, and it cannot keep up in the meta right now. In premium format, after all the changes, I might be wrong, because I don't know what any of the new stuff that Overlord could get in, you know, the reboot. Not to mention that the deck just inherently gets better because of the Ace thing. I can't say how the meta will be, you know, a few months from now. I'm not a mind reader. I'm not Houdini. Like, I can't just predict that off the top of my head. I'm a player who needs to see results, and I need to play it myself before I can give a definite yes or no on if I think Overlord will be good or not in the future. Not to mention, again, we don't know what any of the new Overlord support will be from the trial deck or from the new set, the Q4 set. But yeah, thank you guys very much for watching. Please sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you disagree with some of my points, you could leave some constructive criticism down below. Please just don't start flaming people or just being very bashful. This is just an open discussion that I'd like to have. And something I wanted to talk about being an Overlord player, because I've played Overlords for a very long time. Like, I've always been on and off. It's that and Gears are the decks that I've played. So I wanted to go a little bit more in depth on why I think Overlord is taking a little bit of a back seat in the current meta right now. But yeah, thank you guys very much for watching. I will see you guys in the next video. Yeah, enjoy. Deuces.